Daniel, can you say a few words about yourself? Who are you, and what's your background?
Hi, Raphael. Yeah, so I'm Daniel. I'm a writer and translator. I studied modern languages at the University of Cambridge, and then an MPhil in European cultures and literature. And yeah, more recently, I've been sort of moving towards thinking more about animal rights and sort of issues relating to animals and animal representations. Yeah.
Great. Daniel, you wrote this fascinating essay, which ended up winning the first prize in our essay competition this year. And I was just curious to find out sort of why you participated in the competition. How did you find out about it, and what inspired you to submit an essay?
Yeah, so really, for me, the main sort of pull was I really liked the prompt, but the word that particularly caught my attention was magical. So in the Richard Ryder quote, the idea that there's no magical essential difference, which is really where my idea of framing the essay around this sort of warm-up act in a magic show, that's where that sort of came from. This it really helped me pull a lot of my thinking about animal rights together, by thinking that magic is something, it's a human construct, but it's also got this transcendental, there's this idea of something beyond the ordinary, which I think is really pertinent in animal rights, because hidden behind this puff of smoke, there is, animal suffering, which is simultaneously, it's obscured by the meat and dairy industries with their deliberate misrepresentations of the fact, and also animal suffering plays out in plain sight. So, for example, horse racing, where we see animals dying in front of our eyes. So it's a sort of double or a contradiction of there's off stage and on stage animal suffering, and it's so that's where my inspiration for or my engagement with the question came from, this idea of the magical relation.
Wonderful. And you're a writer, Daniel, you said. So how did you approach writing the essay?
Well, it was something, it took me a long time, really. I've had several different drafts of this essay. It wasn't sort of written all in one go. It was developed over quite a long time, and sort of coming back, adding bits, taking bits away. I really wanted to get the voice right. So this warm-up act, which as a mysterious embodiment, a sort of anonymous, someone who would not normally command attention in this situation, sort of which sort of contributes to the feeling that the magical, the suspense, the mystery around this great offstage presence of the slaughterhouse. So yeah, my writing came with I guess there's you could say there's it's a less serious, less academic style, and that's certainly the what I was going for. There was a sort of subversion of the traditional idea around what constitutes an essay, and yeah, so it just sort of naturally developed into this this first person monologue, essentially, with some audience interaction, which I'd say it was a process of adding bits and then taking a few bits away, which weren't quite working to get the final. Yeah,
fascinating, Daniel. And sort of, I mean, what struck the jury was this more creative style, obviously, that you adopted, the slightly less academic style, which I think for the purposes of this essay worked really well. And you spoke a bit about this sort of warm-up act, the sort of perspective from which you're telling the story. Can you just say a bit more about sort of why you chose that? Was that your initial framing device, from the first draft on, or did you toy with a couple of other ideas and then it struck you that this warm-up act is just a great way of framing the story, the essay?
I think it was my original idea. I can't remember all the way back to February or or January when I started writing. But yeah, I think to me, sort of writing and sort of human language, it's this double-edged sword. So it's the idea we have words, we have language which we can use to describe who we are, to tell our stories, to create narratives of identity. And then on the other side, language is used to deny rights to animals. It's an argument that people use against granting rights to non-human animals, but they can't participate in human language. So yeah, I wanted to subvert the traditional essay approach because it when to me when there's sort of when there's lives 50 billion chickens slaughtered every year, when there's lives on the line, the sort of traditional approach of on the one hand, on the other hand, it feels slightly redundant to be engaging in that process. Obviously there's a place and there's a need for reasoned arguments, for referencing, for nuanced developed arguments, but sort of sitting on the fence or taking a more formal approach for the sake of it is definitely not something I wanted to do. So yeah, the warm-up act idea, I think it's there's so much mystery and deliberate obfuscation around animal suffering, which this anonymous embodied figure, I guess, represents in many ways. We don't know who's talking. We don't know. It's just it could be anyone almost. That's the idea. If I was sort of getting at, yeah.
I thought it was fascinating. Yeah, this idea that the anonymity of the animals is sort of reflected in the anonymity of that warm-up act. We never find out what their name is. They're even called an unofficial warm-up act, so we're not quite sure, are they even supposed to be there or not?
Yeah.
So yeah, I thought that was fascinating. Maybe turning to a slightly more substantive question now about the essay. So you alluded to this idea of magic before and how it caught your attention by the way the question was framed. But you have this really sort of powerful passage in the essay where you ask, how can so much suffering go unnoticed by so many people? And you say, well, the answer is magic. And you have this brilliant line where you say, animal cruelty is a vanishing act. Can you just expand on that idea for us?
Yeah, so the Vanishing Act, yeah, it's I mean, it's slaughterhouses, it's closed doors, it's out of sight, out of mind. And obviously it's the contradiction, as I was saying before, is that animal cruelty is simultaneously behind closed doors and in plain sight. And when it's in plain sight, we sort of create these narratives or these justifications to construct doors to block the real issue being considered and becoming an issue for people that would force them to think about what they're doing. I think that the Vanishing Act, the magic, the tricks, the deceit, it is all plays in with the big corporations, the meat and dairy lobbies, which there was an article just a few days ago in The Guardian about the masters of beef advocacy in the US, where 21,000 influencers and citizen activists have been trained up to promote the sustainable benefits of beef. And every climate research paper states that beef is not sustainable, and yet there's deliberate confusion being created by these industries to justify and to perpetuate their cruel practices. So yeah, there's magic performed by the cruel industries to cloud and to confuse people, and I think magic can be part of the can be part of the solution in terms of turning these tricks back on these industries, and actually, you know, I think the work of the Cambridge Centre for Animal Rights Law, that this is put in something which has too often been backstage and unseen on centre stage, and actually having these debates out in the open, and getting the deceivers to reveal their tricks.
That's really fascinating, because it takes me to my other substantive question that I have for you, Daniel. You know, you mentioned this maybe positive role for magic to play, right? So there's the negative sort of deception that we can find in the sort of animal industries, but there's also a positive role, a positive magic that maybe law has a role to play in. And you know, you've phrased this in terms of the powerful role of storytelling in public law specifically, and you say that, you know, from the Roman Forum through to the TV spectacle of, you know, high-profile court cases, we see the role of storytelling being a really prominent one in law, which I agree with. And I was just curious to see if you have any more thoughts on this, or what exactly your idea was when you wrote this.
Yes, but maybe it comes from my uninformed view of what law is. But yeah, to me, one of the first things I think about with law is, you know, the courtroom setting. It's all defendants and telling stories in order to present facts in a particular way to try to be persuasive. Yeah, so to me, that is something that's very human. It's linked to rhetoric. It's linked to you know, to these ancient theories of rhetoric, and how can we manipulate, obscure, or whatever you want to say, the fact into something which provides a compelling narrative. And it's what people do every day without necessarily realizing that we're always telling ourselves facts in a particular way to justify what we're doing, or to understand what we're doing. And so yeah, so the idea of the public law system, which to me is great work, what's been done to try to work out how might animal rights be compatible with human law. And that's where I, you know, knowing that sort of the law, the legal systems we have in place are these human constructs which are always adapting, always evolving, but fundamentally are created by humans for humans. I sort of have a question there about how can animals as potentially legal persons fit into this context. So that's what I was trying to really get at when I talked about the reliance on storytelling, which seems to be something which excludes animals, and particularly in the case of wild animals, where, you know, potentially animals which sort of live in the few remaining wild spaces of this earth, potentially free from any human interference. What would be the implications and complications of imposing sort of human-based laws to govern these and interfere with these wild spaces and wild animals? So maybe, I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
I think it's a really interesting question, isn't it? There's an increasing number of people suggesting that perhaps there's no spaces like this left, right? So Martha Nussbaum, for instance, in a recent book, wrote that this idea of, you know, wild animals and a sort of a harmonious nature, that if it ever existed, it certainly doesn't exist any longer because of, you know, human created climate change, the impact that humans have, including through the law, even on spaces that may seem remote to us, especially if we live in cities, perhaps, but that nonetheless govern animals living, you know, maybe in a desert or, you know, in a forest somewhere. They're nevertheless going to be impacted by, say, hunting laws that are in place, or indeed by more indirect effects, such as what humans are allowed to do with regard to, you know, carbon emissions and all that. So I think what we're seeing more and more is the idea that human law impacts all sorts of beings, some more than others, but nonetheless impacts all beings. And therefore, there being a need for a more positive, more magical, if you like, change in the law to promote the interests of beings that, so far mostly suffering from the impact of the law, or that the law has on them. So having a more positive spin that goes beyond what we have right now, I think is a challenge, but something that we should probably work towards. Understanding what epistemic limitations we have as humans, the things we don't know, how does it impact a wild animal if you do this or that to them. Predation is a big problem, of course, and how, if at all, to tackle it. Animal rights people disagree on this, but I think, coming back to your idea about storytelling, it's going to come down to being able to tell a compelling story to a lawmaker, to a judge, about what needs to be done in order to improve things, to change, the situation for the better. And I think, again, we're going to come back to that idea of magic and a good way to tell a story.
Yeah. So it's a mix of the legal frameworks, the what the legislation, and then also the sort of these cases that sort of key cases which could set a precedent. And so in these cases where speaking for animals, I guess, is another key question which I kind of had with on that same theme of sort of storytelling and so sort of who is telling these stories, and how can how in cases where animal defendants are not animal defendants as human property, but as their own living, breathing, feeling, suffering being. So that's going to be, so I sort of think the way it's going to be the key question, how they are actually represented in these human settings, and very distinctly human settings of clauses and rhetoric.
Do you think, Daniel, there's a place for animals to be the storytellers? In the essay, you suggest that storytelling, or you at least consider it as a potentially unique sort of human capacity, but sort of knowing what we do now about animal languages, if you're thinking of cetaceans, for instance, and other animals too, about how complex their languages are. In fact, do you see a place for stories to be told by animals rather than just humans?
Yeah, but I think there definitely is, and the key will be understanding, listening closely, even when we don't understand what animals are saying, but sort of listening closely and trying to to empathize and to actually understand. But before you get to that stage, you first need to ascribe such a basic thing as saying that animals are living beings and have the right to life beyond being mere property, or it's hard to listen to a chair. So if an animal has the same legal rights as a chair, then it's hard to, in a legal setting, to then consider an animal as a subject, as a storyteller.
Okay, great. Now, moving towards the sort of end of our fascinating conversation, Daniel, I'd just be curious to hear how you found the writing process itself. Was it a bit of a struggle? Did you enjoy it? How did you feel about writing the actual essay?
Yeah, definitely a struggle at times, because when there's so much you want to say in response to the really wide and open-ended question, having to sort of select certain key points was a challenge. Also, knowing the sort of level of understanding to assume, maybe, and I think it helped with the approach I took, that sort of the bouncing off the audience allowed sort of a few points to be brought out more, without insulting a reader by having to explain stuff, but doing it in a way that shows that, because we do know, it is one of the key things I wanted to highlight, that people just don't know a lot of these things, that people don't yet see animals as in the same way they would see a fellow human in a broader sense. But then on an individual level, if a person's walking down the street and sees a suffering animal, most people are going to stop and help if they. So sort of the disconnect people can have between the instinctive nature and desire to help when they see seeing suffering versus being complicit and being blind to the more widespread, more systematic suffering which they are helping contributing towards.
Do you have any sort of final advice for future participants in the competition? I'm sure our listeners might be interested in that.
I'm not sure really if I'm in a place to give too much advice, but I'd say just write what you want to write. Don't feel like you have to fit into what you expect an essay to look like. Sort of use whatever storytelling and presentational methods that you want, which allow you to make the points you want to make. So yeah, I guess just the freedom to use language in innovative ways to say what you want to say.
Great, that's been a fascinating conversation. Thanks a lot, Daniel, and congrats again on your essay.
Thank you very much.